Behold, His Majesty, King Ramesses, ruler of rulers, has done excellent things for his divine father, Horus the Falcon. He has built a house of millions of years within this mountain.
Like a giant colossus, Egypt dominates the history of the ancient world. But there's a conundrum here in the land of the Pharaohs. There may be an answer, but it will mean redating the great events of ancient times and placing even Ramesses the Great in a new historical setting. We're going to take a journey back in time, a journey which will cast new light on some of the most famous stories in the Bible, illuminating the hidden world of the patriarchs, pharaohs, and kings.
What do you think of this?
Oh, fabulous. Look at that. And the cartouches are right in the front?
One pair of size 12s.
I think so. Unbelievable.
Ramesses.
Exactly.
Okay. A pair of colossal feet of a statue that used to stand right in front of the temple of Ramesses here.
It's going in the back.
Stretching in the distance there. Isn't it?
Isn't that
fantastic?
extraordinary?
I don't know where it is. It's somewhere over in this direction.
In ancient times, these cornfields in the Egyptian delta were the site of a great city.
Well, if you can see anything.
Well, I'm not actually that
Watch
tall.
out for the scarecrows.
According to the Bible, it was a city built by Israelite slaves, toiling under the lash of Pharaoh's overseers.
Now, this looks like the spot.
It should be around here. There's a depression in front of us here to the right.
Yep. Now, there you go. What do you think of that?
Wow, look at that.
This top half of the statue probably belongs to the feet over there, I would think.
Right.
It's the same material, anyway.
Right.
The monuments of Ramesses the Great are all over Egypt. But the simple truth is that archaeologists have found no trace of Moses and the Israelites.
Come along this way, and this statue would have been standing right in front of the gate.
And so, many of today's scholars tend to dismiss the early stories of the Old Testament as little more than legend. Now, new archaeological discoveries could at last be bringing the stories of Genesis and Exodus out of the shadowy world of myth and back into the light of history. Egypt and the Holy Land are neighbours and have been closely related since earliest times. As we learn more about the history of one country, it promises to shed light on the history of the other. It's obvious you can't study Egypt without taking account of biblical history. I first came to Egypt as a 10-year-old, and I've been coming back ever since, piecing together the evidence for a radical new theory, which I believe is going to change our understanding of the past. I want to take you to an Egypt you won't find on a package tour. Years of study and research at the site have led me to the conclusion that in the process of dating Egyptian history, a fundamental error has been made. It seems to me that several centuries have been mistakenly added into the chronology of Egypt, changing our understanding of when things happened in the ancient world. This has led archaeologists who search for evidence of the Old Testament to look in the right places, but in entirely the wrong time, simply because they're relying on the conventional chronology.
The big question, I suppose, is what is chronology? Well, it's the measurement of time. One great scholar called it the backbone of history. Now, try and understand what's going on in the past. We have this thing called the birth of Christ, this line here, if you like. Anything forward from that is modern times, Anno Domini. Now, we're in Anno Domini now. We're in the 1990s. We measure our time from the birth of Christ. But the ancients didn't have that because they didn't know Christ was going to get born. They had to work a different system. And in fact, they dated the events in the reigns of the kings by regnal dating, we call it. Just imagine working backwards through time from the birth of Christ, adding together all the reigns of the different kings going back through time until we get to a particular date in a particular king's reign. That's how historians work out the past. The problems arise when some of these stones here, these reigns, these bits of information are actually missing. Then things start to get really complicated. We might have, for instance, overlapping reigns. In that case, the chronological sums could actually be wrong.
And this has serious implications for the two great histories of ancient Egypt and the Old Testament. We know a lot about the pharaohs and the biblical characters, but there are almost no fixed dates that enable us to make firm links between them. Working back from the traditional date for Christ's birth, the last secure fixed point comes in 664 BC, when we know the Assyrians invaded Egypt and sacked the holy city of Thebes. From then on, we enter a time of confusion, the Third Intermediate Period, when a number of kings were ruling in the Nile Valley at the same time. In this period, 5 dynasties of Egyptian kings reigned. It starts with the 21st dynasty, which the conventional chronology would have us believe began in 1069 BC. It ends with the fall of the 25th dynasty in 664 BC. Out in the desert, just south of Cairo, lies a vast catacomb buried deep beneath the sand. Here, for 1,000 years, the ancient Egyptians toiled to cut the burial vaults of the sacred Apis bulls. The vaults were discovered in the middle of the last century, but then lost again as wind-blown sand covered the site. Now, this underground burial complex has been rediscovered, and a new investigation of the vaults is underway. Ever since I first began to study Egyptology, I've dreamed of getting into these catacombs, because they may hold the key to a chronological puzzle which has perplexed historians for decades and led me to a startling conclusion. If I'm right, these excavations could help unlock a new historical framework for Egypt and for much of the ancient world. For Egyptian history, the implications would be important, but the implications for biblical history could be nothing less than momentous.
Let me show you it's something very interesting here.
You know?
Something you don't know and nobody knows.
Here's the clue that got me started. There should be 7 dynasties worth of pharaohs recorded in these vaults. But archaeologists have found that one dynasty is completely missing. Quite literally, the dates don't add up.
Right.
I think we should take a fresh look at the archaeological evidence. We're going to explore 3 major anomalies, which undermine the chronology currently used by archaeologists and historians.
Never heard of it.
No, nobody.
We're basically talking about rewriting the history of the whole ancient world over a period of several centuries, and it all has to be shown to work before the case can be considered proven or even viable.
Obviously, there are very intricate problems and matters here which need a lot of research, a lot of discussion. And if David has encouraged is encouraging people to look at these in light of his new work in Egypt, then this, I think, is an extremely good thing. This is the way new understandings emerge from people putting up new theories, houses of cards, which can be knocked over.
It's very exciting, very adventurous to try and rewrite the history of the ancient world. But when you see a shift of 200 or 300 years, one automatically says, is this even possible? And he's quite right to challenge us and say, have a look.
As you look at David's theory, he tries to weave a very, very tight tapestry with a lot of disparate, different threads. And there are going to be scholars that are going to say, as in my case, David, I don't agree with this point, I don't agree with that point. And although we may have some validity in disagreeing with a specific point here and here, unless we can substitute another overall pattern that will link all these pieces together in a uniform theory that will replace David's, then David's theory has some validity.
In real life, I can't abide kids. But I would go for a credit card that takes the worry out of shopping on the internet.
Apply for the egg card.
To understand how scholars arrived at their dates, we have to go back to the earliest days of Egyptology. In 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt. But he was interested in much more than military conquest. With him came mathematicians, astronomers, draftsmen and mapmakers, all commissioned to record the wonders of the land of the Pharaohs. But scholars were unable to decipher the exotic hieroglyphs with which the ancient Egyptians adorned their temples and tombs. It took the brilliance of a young French scholar to make the vital breakthrough. Because of his pioneering work on the hieroglyphs, Champollion has been called the father of Egyptology.
This large black stone was found at Rosetta near Alexandria by one of Napoleon's officers in 1799. And it was that cracking of the hieroglyphic code which opened up a window on 3,000 years of history. What Champollion realized was that we had here a royal decree in 3 different scripts. At the top here we have the hieroglyphics, the sacred writing of Egypt. In the middle, this thing the scholars call demotic, a sort of cursive form of hieroglyphics. And at the bottom, the crucial bit, we have ancient Greek. He could read in the Greek that the decree was dedicated to King Ptolemaeus. So if you could read the Greek, it's possible, therefore, to read the hieroglyphics at the top, and that's what he did. He took this name ring here and was able to decipher it as Ptolemies, the Greek king Ptolemy. Once he deciphered the name, from then on, things were easy.
Following the decipherment of hieroglyphics, scholars began to tackle the monumental inscriptions with tremendous vigour, setting to work to awaken those little icons from their 2,000-year-old slumber. They're still working at it today. The walls were suddenly alive with voices from the past. The names of pharaohs, tales of heroic deeds and mighty conquests, and prayers to the gods. And among these were vital clues to the chronology of ancient Egypt, because the historical inscriptions were invariably dated to specific years in the king's reigns. Line by line, the history of Egypt began to emerge. Actually, hieroglyphs aren't that hard to read once you get the hang of it. For instance, take the name Ramesses. We begin with the sign representing the sun god Ra, portrayed as a falcon with a sun disk on his head. The next icon is 3 fox pelts tied together in a knot, which represent the sound Mez. And finally, 2 bolts of cloth, which are 2 S's. This name Ramesses appeared everywhere. With the reign lasting 67 years, it's hardly surprising the Victorians dubbed him Ramesses the Great. In the sheer scale of his monuments, many saw the work of an autocratic despot, bidding for immortality. Every statue, every relief seemed to reflect the sweat and tears of 1,000 slaves. And it was the Old Testament which told of one particular group of enslaved people, the children of Israel.
According to the Bible, Israelite slaves built a store city in the eastern delta called Ramses. And so Ramesses II automatically became the pharaoh who oppressed the Israelites, the pharaoh of the oppression. This was the first tangible link between Egyptian history and the Bible.
So a firm chronological link was made between the pharaohs and the Bible. Moses, who led the children of Israel out of Egypt, was seen as a contemporary of Ramesses II, and that basic connection is still generally accepted today. Less than a decade after he'd deciphered the hieroglyphs, Champollion set out on his first and only visit to Egypt. And it was here that he made the second crucial link between Egypt and the Bible. It was this link, above all, which I believe has led to our fundamental error in Egyptian chronology.
When Champollion finally made it to Egypt, he came here to Karnak, to the great war inscription of Shoshenq I, founder of the 22nd dynasty. Now, this is a very complicated wall. I'll go up and show you what it's all about.
The pharaohs used the exterior walls of temples to record their great military achievements, 20 feet high and originally in glorious technicolor.
On the left side, we have a large scene of Ammon, the god Ammon, dragging rows of captive prisoners from Palestine towards a smiting scene. And these captive prisoners have the names of cities carved on their chests in name rings. These represent the cities which they belong to. And we can almost see an itinerary here. It starts in the top right-hand corner, and we read along the row, and then down one more row, and along again, and down again, all the way through the list. These are the cities which Shoshenq I defeated in Palestine. Now they go towards the smiting scene. A group of captives are crouched down in terror, raising their hands, pleading for mercy. The king stands behind them. In fact, the king's figure is missing now. It's a phantom. It used to be carved in plaster, but the plaster's fallen away. Let me strike the pose, though. He's clasping the hair of the prisoners, and in his right hand he has the mace, and the mace comes down to crush in the skulls of the captives. Champollion cottoned onto one particular name ring, this one up here. Now, he read that as Judah Hamelkuth, which translates as Judah the Kingdom. And the important thing is that he linked that with the very famous passage in the Old Testament about Pharaoh Shishak attacking the kingdom of Judah and plundering the Temple of Jerusalem, just 5 years after the death of Solomon. Needless to say, he was delighted with his discovery. He'd found an Egyptian text which confirmed a biblical text.
So Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem and took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He took all. He carried away also the shields of gold which Solomon had made.
So it looks as though we have a new fixed point in our journey back through time, when Pharaoh Shishak plundered the temple and palaces in Jerusalem. Shishak is now identified as Shoshenq I, founder of the 22nd dynasty. And biblical historians date this event to 925 BC. But the important thing to realize is that this date for Shoshenq I is derived directly from biblical chronology and not from the Egyptian archaeological evidence.
This basic structure hasn't really changed over the last 100 years. It's been tweaked by a few years here and there, but essentially it's remained unaltered. Now, the more research I do, the more convinced I become that the evidence here in Egypt doesn't fit the established picture. I'm talking about several centuries here. Let me show you what I mean.
The first of our three anomalies takes us to Saqqara, the dramatic desert necropolis of ancient Memphis, just a few miles south of Cairo. In 1851, a young Frenchman discovered a sphinx protruding from the sand near the great step pyramid of King Zoser. He began to dig. He found another, and then another. What he'd uncovered was a majestic avenue of sphinxes disappearing into the desert. Auguste Mariette was the first great archaeologist to work in Egypt. After a year of digging, he found himself at the entrance to a huge underground catacomb. By now, he was certain he'd found the long-lost Serapeum, renowned throughout the ancient world. My colleague, Professor Mohammed Ibrahim Ali, is reinvestigating the original excavations. Did Mariette finally get into the vaults themselves?
I think it's in February 1852.
I came upon such disorder that at first sight I despaired of ever recognizing anything.
Yes. What did he find? He found a lot of fragments of stele, shawabtis or shabtis, and some other amulets here, and it was full of sand, debris, rubbish.
So this is all restoration?
The walls are covered with stele. You walk on statuettes of all colors, on vases, on fragments of wooden sarcophagi.
What he found far surpassed his wildest dreams. A series of underground burial chambers, each containing massive stone coffins. Now, this is a good example of a robbed-out sarcophagus, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Basalt?
Yes, it is made of basalt, yes.
They didn't bother moving the lid off, did they?
It's too heavy.
The coffins once contained the mummified remains, not of kings, but of bulls, the sacred Apis bulls. The ancient Egyptians saw the Apis bull as a living god, and when the bull died, it was given a funeral fit for a king. The priests and officials offered written prayers at the bull's burial. These were preserved on hundreds of donation stele, stone tablets, set into the walls of the tombs.
Covered with stele, which was put by the high priests and priests and the
These stele record the names of the pharaohs who ruled when the bulls were buried. They're a wonderful source for the history and chronology of the period. This is the very last one, isn't it? It's nicely carved. At first, it seems that we have here over 1,000 years of Egyptian history, recorded in an unbroken sequence. But a closer look suggests to me that all is not well. Auguste Mariette sent his finds back to Paris, which ever since Napoleon had been one of the great centers of Egyptology. Even today, the monuments of ancient Egypt find their echoes in the architecture of modern Paris. The treasures ended up here, in the Museum of the Louvre, where the great task of cataloguing and studying them still continues. The sphinxes which once lined the avenue leading to the Serapeum now guard the stairs to the Egyptian galleries, and it's here that you'll find one of my favourite exhibits, the statue of a young Apis bull calf. But it's the stele attached to the sacred bull burials which really count. Now these are the things that really make all the difference. This is real history here, because from this material here, all these hieroglyphs, we can construct a history of the past. Let me give you an example of sorts of things we can do with these Apis stele. Here's a very nice picture of an Apis here with the king worshipping the bull. And then we have a year date down here. It says year 23, it says the first month of the summer season, and then we have day 15 here, and then we have the cartouche or name ring of the king over here. But the really neat thing we have with these stele, and what makes them so interesting, is that there was only ever one bull alive at any one time. So if we have a sequence of these stele here recording their burials, we have an opportunity to reconstruct the chronology of the past. And it's that reconstruction that gives us the framework for our history. And how far underground are we?
About, we can say 20 meters.
20 meters. According to the conventional chronology, the bull burials ought to have spanned a period of around 600 years. But Mariette found evidence for only 22 Apis bull burials for this period. We know that the average lifespan of a bull is about 18 years, so these bulls cover at most a period of 400 years. It seems that 200 years worth of burials are entirely missing from the vaults. When Mariette excavated the so-called lesser vaults, he found no trace whatsoever of the Apis bulls of the 21st or early 22nd dynasty. So it's not what Mariette found in these vaults that interests me, it's what he didn't find.
Cool, look at this chamber, it's huge. Be careful again.
Not a single stela or inscription could be identified with a pharaoh from that period.
It's collapsing now. Just made a huge crack here. So this is the chamber that Mariette says has 3 21st dynasty bulls in it, but you can't see anything at the moment.
No, I can't, because if there is anything, it should be under the debris.
Right,
here.
well look at it, I mean there's tons of it.
And
Mariette thought he detected 3 intact Apis bull burials in this chamber, but the conditions were so dangerous that he abandoned his attempt to reach them. But even if there are 3 bulls here, that would still mean 8 bulls unaccounted for, which leaves us with a gap of roughly 150 years.
Just think about what might be here if Mariette's right.
I'm sure there are a lot of things.
Are they still here, waiting to be found, or did they never really exist, as I now believe? Now I think that this apparent absence is telling us something.
Remove the sand from here.
Yeah.
Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Time and again, people say there is no X. X comes out of the ground 20 years later. So we can't say there were no Apis bulls in the 21st, early 22nd dynasty. It's a matter of waiting and seeing.
But if we had to wait for every last scrap of evidence to come to light before developing any theories, then we'd have to wait for a very long time.
Now that's pink granite, isn't it, from Aswan?
So I think there's a period of time unaccounted for by the Apis bull burials, perhaps as much as 200 years. There certainly seems to be a serious question mark around the time of the 21st dynasty. The second major anomaly takes us south to the Valley of the Kings. After the last of the great pharaohs, Ramesses III, had died, things began to go badly wrong in Egypt. There was famine in Thebes. Law and order was breaking down. The workmen began to plunder the treasure from the very tombs they had built. The officials in Thebes decided that something had to be done. The tombs in the Valley of the Kings were no longer safe. In a top-secret mission, the bodies of the pharaohs were moved out of the valley and over a precipitous mountain pass. Near this temple, just outside the Valley of the Kings, the officials chose a tomb where several members of a priestly family already lay buried. It was so inaccessible that they thought the tomb would be an ideal place to hide the mummies of the pharaohs. High on the rocky outcrop was a deep shaft, and here the bodies of the pharaohs were lowered into the tomb. This was meant to be their final resting place. Their plan almost worked. For 3,000 years, the god-kings of ancient Egypt lay undisturbed at the bottom of the rock crevice. But they had reckoned without the tenacity of Egypt's tomb robbers. Today, the villagers who live near the Valley of the Kings make a living selling trinkets to tourists. But an earlier generation of villagers made good money robbing tombs and selling plundered antiquities to Victorian travellers. And so it was that in the 1870s, a local family stumbled on a narrow shaft in the rock, broke into the tomb, and found it crammed full of the mummified bodies of the lost pharaohs. Luckily, the Egyptian authorities got wind of the find, took possession of the mummies, and quickly moved them from the royal cache to the safety of the Cairo Museum. It's thanks to that chance discovery that we can still look upon the faces of some of the greatest rulers of the ancient world. Not least King Seti I and his famous son, Ramesses II. Apart from the mummies, a great deal of historical information can be gleaned from the coffins in which they were stored. But once again, there's an anomaly with the dates.
Now this is the crucial coffin. It belongs to Seti I, the father of Ramesses II. You can see his names here on the coffin. This coffin and the body of the king was placed in the royal cache in the entrance corridor, the low entrance corridor at the very beginning of the shaft. Now we have an inscription on the coffin which tells us when that took place. It was in year 10 of King Siamen. Now King Siamen was a ruler of the middle of the 21st dynasty.
So the coffins were taken to the secret tomb in 968 BC, according to the conventional chronology, and the tomb was then sealed.
But there's a problem here. When the curators of the Cairo Museum began to unwrap one particular mummy of a minor official from Karnak, they discovered bandages with dates on, dates of the burial of the person, Jeb-Tari-Fank. Now he was buried in year 11 of Shoshenq I, the founder of the 22nd dynasty.
In the conventional chronology, that's 934 BC. But we know from reports of the discovery that this official, Jeb-Tari-Fank, was placed deep in the tomb beyond the coffin of Seti I. So how could the official have been buried 34 years after the royal cache was sealed? Of course, there are those who think this anomaly can be dismissed.
What a mess that was. It was a jangle of coffins and things might have been moved. The whole excavation was a complete emergency job. Get that lot out before the locals rob it and ship it down to Cairo at top speed. And that was in the 1880s when technique wasn't what it is today.
Well, scholars suggest that the cache was reopened for the burial of this minor official, but I don't think that's possible.
Here's the problem. King Seti's coffin was placed in the narrow entrance corridor near the mouth of the tomb. The coffin of Jeb-Tari-Fank, on the other hand, was found deep inside the tomb. But there wasn't enough room in the narrow corridor for it to be manoeuvred past Seti's coffin, which blocked the entrance passage. So King Seti's coffin must have been placed here last.
If you can't move the order of the coffins, then you have to rethink the order of the dynasties. And I've come to the conclusion that dynasties 21 and 22 were actually ruling in Egypt at the same time, but from different capitals.
It's always been thought that the 21st dynasty ruled Egypt before the 22nd dynasty. But I think they existed side by side, and that means losing over 100 years from the conventional chronology. As a result, all the earlier dynasties moved downwards to fill in the gap. And the pharaohs of those dynasties have also to be redated.
This lies at the heart of the theory that I've been developing. The two dynasties simply overlapped. Now, if that's the case, then the time they actually take up in history has to be radically reduced.
It was yet another French archaeologist who excavated the ancient city of Tanis just before the Second World War. Today, the man I've come to meet in Paris is Professor Jean Yoyot, a recognized authority on these Tanis excavations.
Bonjour, Professor. How are you?
Nice to see you again. Good morning. The tombs of two pharaohs were uncovered there, side by side. The question is, which tomb came first?
Your plan it's not up to date.
Right, okay, fair enough. Professor Yoyot is reluctant to discuss the inside of the tomb, where I think the problem lies. All right, but how can we talk about the interior if we don't have some plan to work from to show the point of logic of the construction?
No, but we can work only from documents.
The trouble is that new French archaeological plans for the inside of the tomb are not yet published, so Professor Yoyot won't even consider my argument. This makes it very difficult to discuss the new chronology. It seems to me that there is a sort of hierarchy in this sort of world, Egyptology or scholarship, and if you come and question the precepts, the things that have already been decided yonks ago, then you're challenging, you're being sensational. All I simply want to do is get one or two answers to one or two problems that I've observed or raised during the course of my research. And we're in a situation here where I'm not allowed to do that because it's sensational to do so. It's rocking the boat. I've asked Professor Bob Bianchi to come to Tanis to take a close look at the two tombs. I hope to persuade him that there's a major chronological problem here for which there can only be one explanation. It's the way the two tombs have been constructed that doesn't make sense. According to the conventional chronology, the tomb of King Azorkon of the 22nd dynasty, on the right, should have been built after the tomb of King Susenes of the 21st dynasty, on the left. But when you look at the layout of the two tombs, it's clear that King Susenes' tomb, on the left, cuts into Azorkon's tomb on the right. A tomb which, according to the current chronology, hadn't even been built yet. I think the anomaly here is perhaps the most telling of all the anomalies that I've brought forward so far and you've had a look at. What we've got then is a tomb over here and the one we're sitting on as well. Now, this tomb we're looking at is a 22nd dynasty tomb. It belongs to King Azorkon II. And the one over here is a 21st dynasty tomb and it belongs to King Susenes I.
Right, exactly, okay.
But just look at it. We've got something really weird here. We've got the straight line of the north face of the tomb runs along here, and then it just takes it suddenly cuts away like that, and then comes back again on that side. And this tomb, the 21st dynasty tomb, cuts into the 22nd dynasty tomb.
Exactly.
Right, I'll go down this end. If you pale it out to me.
I'll give it to you that way, and we'll come this way.
Okay. Great colour, this, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it shows up very nicely.
Things become clearer when you mark out the original line of King Azorkon's tomb. Looking down on them, I think you can see how both tombs have been altered and how one cuts into the other.
So the edge of Azorkon's tomb, the 22nd dynasty tomb, comes to about here.
Right.
And you can now see the run of the original north face of the tomb.
Exactly. And all of this that we're standing on now was from this tomb that was added when that material was robbed out.
That's right.
And I think that if we get down to that corner, maybe, David, we might be able to see more evidence of this.
Over here? Okay.
Because there's stone that's left over. If you come down in this corner, you can see how this has been cut to be a 90-degree angle, like this.
Right.
And we can follow this cutting all the way down, even to the block that I'm standing on. If we had a brush, you can start to begin to see here, as we just try to move some of this, that we do have this cut.
Yep.
So this stone was notched, in a sense, to be able to fit it comfortably into this, just like this. So that's, I think, is proof positive that this is a pre-existing structure. Absolutely.
Okay. But this is the 22nd dynasty tomb, and this is the 21st dynasty tomb. So therefore, the 21st dynasty king must have died after the 22nd dynasty king.
Exactly. Whoa, it's pretty dark down there.
Well, I suppose I'm going first then, am I?
I hope so.
There we go. Let's see.
Get rid of those scorpions for me. Whoa.
Right, what we're interested in is this entrance here to the burial chamber. Can you see how it's been cut back to widen it? But then the actual passageway into it is at a different angle. It's not straight, it comes across.
Because they had to make room for two extra burials, the antechamber was shortened, and therefore the entrance into one of the main burial chambers had to be built at a strange angle.
The reason for that is right behind you is the two burial chambers that were added on, which cut into the tomb of Azorkon, are right here.
Right.
So this shows you that the plan, the overall scheme, was modified halfway through to add these two burial chambers, right? And they've shortened the width of the antechamber, hence why they've had to modify this particular entrance here.
Right.
Okay. So the big question is, have I been able to convince you that this tomb we're standing on, the 21st dynasty tomb, was built after the 22nd dynasty tomb over there?
It's a very, very convincing argument architecturally. But what if that tomb was built earlier and then reused for the burial of Ozorkon II?
Well, that would be the only possible explanation we have left. But I think we can actually demonstrate that's also not right. Well,
Right.
there's one other clue, and that's actually inside the tomb. I think this time it's your turn to go in
My
first.
turn to go and scare all the
Yeah, you can scare
ghosts away?
all the
Okay.
ghosts away this
Well
time.
then, watch your head. I'll repay the favor, okay?
Okay.
And we're looking for that one text.
No, it's actually over here, right near the entrance. So we can see it very clearly here. It says Carpes, that's the mother of Ozorkon II there, so a little determinative figure.
Right.
Made it for him.
That's
and
right.
Him is the king, Ozorkon II, and it presumably is the tomb.
Is the tomb, yes.
So I think this confirms that this structure, this tomb structure here, originally belonged to Ozorkon. It was built by his mother.
That's right. And there's no question then, because of this inscription, that this is not a reused monument from a later date. And I think that ices it right there for us.
Great.
In the conventional chronology, King Susenes of the 21st dynasty died long before King Ozorkon of the 22nd dynasty. But the evidence from Tanis shows that, on the contrary, King Susenes died after King Ozorkon. This confirms that the two dynasties ruled at the same time, and the conventional chronology has been artificially extended by several centuries.
The tombs cannot be in the order in which traditional scholars want them to be established. The tomb of Susenes does actually go on top of the tomb of Ozorkon II. And here I think we have a major, major stumbling block. Well, if you then take the third anomaly, which I think is the most compelling, and then step back, and then say, well, maybe there's this anomaly with the royal cache, and maybe there's this anomaly with the bulls, I think David makes a case for challenging received wisdom about how we're viewing these other areas chronologically. And I think that's very, very important. He's raised the question, and at least in terms of the Tanis burials, has successfully refuted, I think, conventional wisdom.
In this historical detective story, we've investigated three puzzling conundrums: the case of the missing bulls, the case of the misplaced coffin, and the case of the misdated tomb. So far, the evidence suggests that we have to reduce the conventional chronology by around 150 years. But I haven't finished yet, because we still have to tackle the issue of using the Bible to date Egyptian history. We're back at the place where the great French scholar Champollion made the first firm link between Egyptian history and the Bible. Remember how Champollion had identified Shoshenq I as the biblical pharaoh Shishak, who plundered the temple in Jerusalem. If we look again at the wall where Shoshenq recorded his military campaign, this time with a more critical eye, I think you'll see that the similarities between the Bible and the Egyptian text were seized upon rather too readily. There are, in fact, significant differences.
Some scholars are now beginning to question this identification between Pharaoh Shoshenq and the biblical Shishak. For starters, Champollion's Judah Hamalkuth, Judah the kingdom, is not Judah Hamalkuth at all, this name ring over there. It's actually Yad Hamelech, which means hand of the king, and it represents a monument like a stela which is erected somewhere up in the countryside. Now, moreover, the city of Jerusalem is also entirely missing from the list. It should be up there in the second row. It's perfectly preserved, but the city is missing. Jerusalem does not appear in Shoshenq I's campaign list. The whole thrust of the campaign is in totally the wrong area.
Whereas the biblical Shishak campaigns against Judah and reaches Jerusalem, Shoshenq skirts the kingdom of Judah and campaigns to the north, in Israel. The two campaigns seem to contradict each other. So I took Bob back to the wall to see what he thought.
Jerusalem's not mentioned here, neither of the treasures, and in the Egyptian perspective,
Right.
if you go into a city and you plunder it of its treasures, it gets listed.
I think that the basic problem here is we're looking at two texts.
Yeah.
that scholars have attempted in the past to find nice interfaces between the two.
Right.
And the interpretation is to either force this Egyptian text to fit the Old Testament or to force the Old Testament to fit the Egyptian text.
Yeah.
So we need to be able to come to grips with the fact that we're really trying to compare apples and oranges in this particular instance.
Okay, but one apple says that Jerusalem was taken over and the gold was taken out of the temple.
Exactly.
And the orange says that they didn't go anywhere near Jerusalem.
Exactly. All right, I think
so. I mean, we're comparing two things with two different sources which don't seem to correspond. And on that basis, can we actually use it as a key anchor point in Egyptian chronology?
No, I think that the point that you're making is that foundation synchronism that everybody was so smug about accepting is eroded away. That is a foundation stone that has been part and parcel of Egyptology for almost 150 years, maybe more. A person was allowed to participate. If one challenges that, then one is really taking out a major, major building block, and the chronological links between Egypt and the Old Testament really come crashing down.
This link between the Bible and Egyptian chronology has distorted our understanding of ancient times. If it really can be broken, then a whole new range of possibilities opens up.
I've taken you through some pretty complicated material so far. But what I hope I've done is demonstrate to you that it's very dangerous to use the Bible to date Egyptian history. Now what I want to do is to construct a framework for Egyptian history quite independent of any external sources, using only the Egyptian archaeological evidence. And ironically, it's this alternative approach which produces some amazing new links between the Pharaohs and some of the best known characters in the Old Testament.
Just over 100 years ago, the Dominican friars of Jerusalem made a curious discovery. At the time, its significance was overlooked, and the objects unearthed were soon all but forgotten. But there's a clue here, a clue to the existence of a fabled Old Testament king of Israel. The trail which will lead us to King Solomon begins in Egypt. I was working on a new dating system for Egyptian history. Only later did I realize that my work has important implications for biblical history. The more research I did, the more I realized that the accepted dates for the pharaohs have to be wrong. This has distorted our entire view of ancient history and has left the Israelites without an archaeological footprint in the ancient world. In the last century, scholars were brought up on the Bible, the most influential book of Western civilization. The new breed of archaeologists went out to the Holy Land in Egypt armed with a trowel in one hand and the Bible in the other, trying to prove links between the Bible and the civilizations of the ancient Near East. The trouble is, it's these links which have confused our interpretation of biblical archaeology. The date, 664 BC, when the Assyrians sacked Thebes, is the last fixed date in Egyptian history. The current chronology suggests another fixed date of 925 BC, when an Egyptian king the Bible calls Shishak plundered the Temple of Jerusalem. And Shishak is generally thought to be the Egyptian pharaoh Shoshenq. But I'm convinced that Shishak and Shoshenq are not the same person, and that the accepted dates for Egyptian history are out by several centuries. What I want to do is to build up a new chronology for ancient Egypt, which is independent of any biblical links. With this new time frame, we can then go in search of archaeological evidence for the Old Testament stories. We start in a desolate place called the Wadi Hammamat, far out in Egypt's eastern desert. There's a quarry here, seldom visited, even by Egyptologists. Here, in 496 BC, a royal architect carved a genealogy, his family tree, high up on the cliff. We're certain about its date because the inscription was carved during the Persian occupation of Egypt in the reign of King Darius, and his dates are secure.
It's a bit tricky. Only a few more feet now.
I've asked Professor Bob Bianchi, an Egyptologist from New York, to take a look at what I think is a vital clue for the true dating of Egyptian history.
Oh, look at this here. École du Louvre, 1984. That's an unusual bit of graffiti. 3,000 years difference between the two inscriptions.
I guess.
Right, look what we've got then. Down here, got the label text itself with the date.
Right.
And
That
then,
establishes the date in the reign of Darius the first,
First.
which is a fixed point for us.
that's right, so
Okay.
it's year 26.
Right.
Fourth month of summer season of the king of Upper Lower Egypt, and then the cartouche is here is Darius. And here we have the title of the person who inscribed the block, and it's Merkart, which means royal architect. There's a nice determinative there with the little man with the basket on his head. And the name of the individual is here, Knemibre. He's the guy who inscribed this text.
Yeah, and that's where it's this inscription is really interesting as a personal document, not an official document, because it would indicate that he was up here. He may have had a little bit of time on his hands while they were quarrying out the stone, and he decided to carve not only his own titles but then his ancestry. And he places himself actually into a long distinguished family of royal architects. So what he's trying to do is he says that there's a long line of royal architects in Egypt's history, but my family of these 22 people are just, you know, the cat's meow. We're the greatest thing that ever existed.
The crucial bit of the inscription for me is this section here from Knemibre, our first royal architect in the list. It goes right back generation after generation after generation down to this one down here somewhere. Here he is, Har-em Sa-F.
Right.
Okay, let's give that a clean. You got the constipated budgie, the M, then Sa, and then horned viper, Sa-F, Har-em Sa-F.
So we can work our way back down through the 14th generation and be fairly sure when their floor it was.
But what we do know is that Knemibre, the guy who wrote this inscription in 496 BC, because we have the date here. So we start in 496 BC, and then if we make 20 years per generation working down the inscription, and we get down to here, we actually have a date for this guy.
Right.
And that's the crucial thing. And we can find that guy at another site.
Adel! Where you going, Adel? Aswan, can you give us a lift to Silsila? Yes, quite? Shukran.
Bob and I are now off to find the name of the pharaoh who employed the royal architect Har-em Saf. We'll discover that pharaoh's name nearly 90 miles up the Nile, almost a day's journey by boat. Our journey up the Nile is a journey back in time. We start in 496 BC, when the royal architect carved his family tree on the cliff face. We then go back 14 generations to the architect's ancestor, Harem-Saf. Scholars accept that on average, a generation lasted about 20 years. And that's how we can date Harem-Saf and the pharaoh he served.
Let's do a calculation and see if we can work out where Harem-Saf should be based on the Khmer text then. So what we have is then year 26 of Darius the first, okay.
Which converts into our calendar as
496?
496, okay.
BC, and we're very safe with that date.
That's correct.
We all accept that date, no problems.
Right.
Now we've got 14 generations from Khmer back to Harem-Saf, this guy we're going to be searching for now. So if we give each one 20 years.
Fine.
Okay. 14 generations times 20 years, that gives us 280.
Okay,
all right?
Yes.
And let's add those two together.
Okay.
And that gives us 776.
Well, coincidence. That's the traditional date of the beginning of the Olympic Games in Greece.
Nice and easy to remember.
Okay.
So now, having got Harem-Saf dated to 776,
right.
The key thing now is to find out who he served as royal architect.
All right.
If we can identify the king who he served, then we can date that king to 776 BC.
It was from this rock quarry at Jebel el Silsila that the sandstone blocks were cut for the magnificent temples of Thebes. In ancient times, when heavy loads moved on the water, these rock quarries were ideally placed. Now it's well off the beaten track. Quarries are a great place to find inscriptions. These steely, monumental inscriptions bear witness to one pharaoh's prayers to the gods.
Well, yeah, we better get over. Down into the, it's a long hike now from the landing.
Yeah, it's about...
There's actually a little marker for the boat landing, huh?
Yeah.
But now we're off to find another royal inscription. It records the cutting of stone for a great gateway. Harem-Saf supervised the work on behalf of Pharaoh.
There she goes.
What would you reckon to that then?
Fabulous. That's on the whole face.
It's a bit in shadow,
yeah,
though, isn't
that's
it? It's
really
used to it.
unfortunate.
Yeah, it's a bit shallow.
The inscription is weather-worn, but still just discernible.
Okay, we're finding the... It's here. It's the tongue, that's the two heads, that's the Khat,
Yeah,
and there's the T.
Yeah, and
then
Menu.
the Menu Neb Tawi,
Okay.
and then
down
Hor Sa,
Yeah.
and then we go up to column 5 to get the F, the horned viper. Yeah.
So what have we got there? We've got the overseer of the works of the monuments of Lord of the Two Lands, or
Yes,
the royal architect.
The royal architect of the monuments of the Lord of the Two Lands, i.e.
then-
Pharaoh,
And then Harem-Saf.
and Harem-Saf. Okay, now we want to be able to locate the name of his monarch, his Pharaoh, under whom he served.
In fact, just over here.
And there we have the cartouche, the royal ring containing the hieroglyphs of the pharaoh's name.
Shoshenq. So Shoshenq the First, the man we've been talking about. All right, so now we know that our Harem-Saf, the one that we saw at Wadi Hammamat,
Right.
was the royal architect for Shoshenq the First. So now we can date Shoshenq the First to around 776.
776, okay.
The conventional chronology gives a date of around 925 BC for Shoshenq I. But this date is a biblical date, based on his identification with Shishak. The Egyptian archaeological evidence, on the other hand, shows that Shoshenq can now be dated to around the beginning of the 8th century. Shoshenq I cannot therefore be the biblical Shishak who plundered the Temple of Jerusalem. So if Shoshenq isn't Shishak, who is? To answer that question, we have to return to the genealogy of the royal architects in the Wadi Hammamat. This genealogy doesn't end in 776 BC. It goes back a further 8 generations, back to a royal architect who served the most famous pharaoh of all, Ramesses the Great. Ramesses II is currently dated to the 13th century BC. But using this genealogy in the same way as we did before, we discover that he reigned 350 years later in time. So it was Ramesses the Great who was ruling in Egypt when the Bible tells us that a pharaoh called Shishak plundered the Temple of Jerusalem. Could it be that Ramesses and Shishak were one and the same?
I think it's very, very extraordinary that Ramses II is identified with Shishak. That's unbelievable. I think that's going to raise a lot of eyebrows. It's going to cause a lot of people pause. It will cause many, many scholars to dismiss David's theory out of hand. I think after you get over the initial shock, however, and begin to look at his evidence, then maybe the shock will be a little bit, the edge will be taken off.
Ramesses II built, inscribed and usurped more monuments than any other pharaoh. He was also one of the great warrior kings of Egyptian history, recording many of his military achievements on the walls of his temples. So, if he's the pharaoh who plundered the Temple of Jerusalem, we should be able to find some reference to that military campaign here in Egypt.
So here we are at the Ramesses II's mortuary temple, with all the birds twittering in the background. And this is the place where I reckon the real Shishak campaign is recorded. And it's recorded right up there on that block, leaning out over the edge of the pylon.
The whole relief shows rows of conquered cities. Captives from those cities are being escorted back to Egypt by Ramesses II's sons. The wall represents selected highlights from a major military campaign into Palestine and Syria, and our block appears to be the culmination of that campaign.
What it says actually on the block is the town which His Majesty plundered in year 8. And the name of the town is recorded right at the bottom of the inscription. And the name of the town is Shalem. Now, Shalem is the earliest name of Jerusalem in the Bible.
Here, then, is the first clue that might allow us to identify Ramesses the Great with the biblical Shishak. Ramesses plundered the city of Shalem in the 8th year of his reign. Jerusalem means the city of Shalem. Moreover, this is the only surviving record of an Egyptian campaign against Jerusalem. But this is not the only evidence that links Ramesses II to a conquest of Israel. The Egyptian Museum in Cairo houses an astonishing collection of treasures. One of the most important objects is the so-called Israel Stela, this great inscribed slab. So far, we've seen that Ramesses the Great plundered a city called Shalem, otherwise identified as Jerusalem.
But we need more than the name Shalem. We need to find evidence that Ramesses II campaigned against the people of Israel. Now, I think we have that evidence. The trail begins here with this great stela, which has the only mention of Israel in the whole corpus of Egyptian texts. The bottom of the stela is a poem. It summarizes the defeats of Egypt's enemies. We have Libyans, Hittites, the land of Canaan, the cities of Ashkelon, Gezer, and Genoam, and then most importantly, this line here: Israel is laid waste, his seed is no more. Recently, some very exciting research has shown that this poem is represented on a monumental scale in the temples of Karnak.
The princes are prostrate, saying, "Peace." Not one raises his head among the 9 bows.
The problem for me is that the Israel Stela is dated not to Ramesses II, but to his son Meremptah. But I think Meremptah is recording the achievements of his dynasty, the victories of his grandfather and his father. This makes sense when you examine the battle scenes here at Karnak, where each line of the poem can be matched in sequence to the military campaigns of Seti I and Ramesses II.
We begin here with the wars of Seti I, the father of Ramesses II and the grandfather of Meremptah. In the upper scene, he's fighting against Chehanu, the Libyans.
Desolation is for Chehanu.
Then the lower scene is the battle against the Hittites, Hatti of Anatolia.
Hatti is pacified.
So the first two scenes correspond exactly to the first two lines of the poem on the Israel Stela. The lines don't represent the victories of Meremptah, but rather those of his grandfather, Seti I.
As we reach the end of the wall and turn the corner, there's another battle scene. This time, Seti is fighting against Canaan, the city of Canaan.
Plundered is Canaan with every evil.
And then there's a door leading into the hypostyle hall.
So, just as the first half of the poem records the triumphs of Seti I, I think the second half of the poem represents the triumphs of Ramesses II, recorded here on the south side of the temple.
Carried off is Ashkelon, seized upon is Gezer. Yenoam is made non-existent. Israel is laid waste. His seed is no more.
This tiny fragment of a battle scene on these two blocks turns out to be the only visual record of Israelites ever to be found in the land of the Pharaohs.
Look, we've got Ashkelon, Gezer and Genoam, and the blocks representing Israel. On the right side, this huge wall, again Ramesses II, his battle against Syria, Karu. So the whole thing here is Ramesses II. So now we have a second clue. First we have the Shalem inscription, where Ramesses II attacks and plunders a city called Shalem. I think that's Jerusalem. And now we have Ramesses II attacking the Israelites.
But how can Ramesses be the pharaoh whom the Bible calls Shishak? Their names sound so different. To find the answer to that question, we must pay a visit to the mortuary temple of another Ramesses, Ramesses III at Medina Habu.
Standing here now beneath the south wall of the great Migdol gateway of Ramesses III. And what used to be here was a harem quarter of the king, where all the daughters and the wives of the pharaoh used to live when he came to Thebes. And in fact, we're looking at one tiny block of the original wall there, still with the surviving inscriptions. And what we have originally on the wall was a scene of the daughters of Pharaoh approaching the king who was sat on a throne. And in between, we have the text of the speech of the first daughter, and she's speaking to her father. In this particular case, she's referring to him by his familiar name, what we call the hyperchoristicon. Now this hyperchoristicon is like a shortened name. It's like Beth for Elizabeth, Di for Diana,
And that name is written here with 2 hieroglyphs, and they're both the same hieroglyph. It's the bolt of cloth, and that is the letter S in Egyptian. So we have 2 S's, S followed by S. So the name Ramesses can be shortened to SS. But Ramesses II's familiar name was written in a more complex form, Sisa. The Bible was written in Hebrew, and in Hebrew the Egyptian S often becomes SH. So Sisa would then become Shisha.
David is very, very convincing in showing that Ramses II, or any Ramessid pharaoh for that matter with the name of Ramses, could have an abbreviated or nickname, something like SS, Shishi or Shoshi or something like that, and I think that's very convincing. The stumbling block for me, however, is that Shishak ends in a K, K, and all of the transmutations or all of the variations of Ramesses' name never end in this final K.
And this has been worrying me for donkey's years, but I think there may be a solution now. The biblical redactor or editor often uses puns or plays on words when trying to transfer a foreign name into the Hebrew language. For instance, the name Jezebel, which means Baal is prince, becomes in Hebrew Isbaal, which means where is the piece of dung? In other words, an insult. Now what happens if we have the same thing here with the name Shishak? The Egyptian name Shisha becomes Shishak, which means the one who assaults. In other words, an attacker of cities. The perfect description for Ramesses II. So I reckon I've made a good case for identifying Ramesses as Shishak of the Bible. The plundering of Shalem inscribed on the block of stone. The military campaign against Israel on the temple walls. And Shisha, the familiar name of Ramesses the Great. Perhaps the final piece of the jigsaw is to be found here at Abu Simbel, with this magnificent scene of Ramesses II, astride his chariot in full war cry. Now, Ramesses is attacking a city. It's a wall city on top of a steep hill. The people of the town are pleading for Pharaoh's mercy. There's absolutely no resistance from them. The text tells us that Ramesses was campaigning in the hill country. In the valley below, a shepherd is fleeing in terror from the horse's hooves of the chariot. Above him, 2 citizens come outside the gate to plead with Ramesses for their lives. High on the ramparts, there appears to be a king offering an incense burner towards Ramesses, begging his forgiveness, and behind him, a woman and a child. The strange thing is the city represented on this scene isn't actually named. Where the name of the city should be, the wall's completely blank. It's as if Ramesses is toying with us, expecting us to know what the name of the city is. Well, I think I know. I think it's Jerusalem. If we compare this scene with Shishak's attack, there are a number of similarities. Jerusalem is one of only 2 major cities in the hill country of Israel. It stands on a steep-sided hill. The Bible tells us that the Israelites put up no resistance and simply handed over their treasures to the Egyptian king. It all seems to fit. So armed with our new chronology, it's time to journey to the Holy Land, to begin our search for the legendary kings of Israel. In the conventional chronology, Ramesses II is seen as the pharaoh who oppressed the Israelites and a contemporary of Moses. But because the Egyptian evidence suggests that 350 years must be taken out of the chronology, Ramesses drops down in time. His campaign against Jerusalem in the 8th year of his reign now falls in 925 BC. So Ramesses II came to the throne in Egypt just as the reign of a famous biblical king was coming to an end in Israel, the legendary Solomon. Of all the figures in the Old Testament, Solomon is remembered as the most magnificent. He was the great builder king who constructed the temple and the palaces of Jerusalem. His wealth was so renowned that the Queen of Sheba herself came to see the wonders of his court. But here in Jerusalem, the archaeological evidence for Solomon and all his glory is out of reach.
The problems with trying to find Solomon in Jerusalem are neatly summed up by this wall here. On my left-hand side here we have blocks from Herod's period, King Herod. Right at the top there are the Islamic blocks from the Islamic walls of the Temple Mount. And over here on the other side of the straight joint we have Second Temple blocks. Now, of course, Solomon's temple was the first temple in Jerusalem, the Temple of Yahweh. And also the Palace of Solomon is somewhere deep inside here. We will never find the Temple of Solomon or his palace. They're hidden away, inaccessible to us today. The politics of Jerusalem will prevent it, and so will the religious problems.
What we need to do then is look for a ruined city identified with Solomon. For that we must head north to Megiddo, the Armageddon of the Bible. As an Egyptologist used to walls covered in hieroglyphs, it's a strange experience visiting a site like Megiddo. The archaeological sites in Israel are very different from those in Egypt. With so few inscriptions here, it's easy to understand why there are major problems with biblical archaeology.
As I see it, the really great problem we have with Palestinian archaeology or Holy Land archaeology is the mute character of the monuments. These stones simply don't speak to us. They don't tell us which king built this gateway. Now, if this was an Egyptian monument, it would be covered from top to bottom in hieroglyphs, naming the king, recording particular events in the king's reign. Very easy to date. But here we have no such information. So the interesting thing is, how do they date this monument? Well, ironically enough, they actually use Egyptian objects inscribed with the names of pharaohs to date whole strata here, whole occupation levels, and monuments. So if I'm going to change Egyptian dates, doesn't that mean everything else has to change here?
Let's see how this works. Traditionally, Solomon has been placed in the Iron Age, around 970 BC, and Ramesses II in the Late Bronze Age, around 1280 BC, centuries before Solomon's time. When archaeologists dig up a plaque of Ramesses II here in the Holy Land, they use it to date the levels of the ruined city. But I've brought the dates of Ramesses II, and therefore the Bronze Age, right down into the 10th century BC. That means we must search for Solomon's palaces and gateways, not in the Iron Age levels, but in the levels of the prosperous Late Bronze Age.
The kingdoms of Israel, particularly that of Solomon, are generally regarded as having occurred in the early part of the Iron Age. David would ask people to regard Solomon in the Late Bronze Age. That is going to be difficult for most traditionalists to accept. But if you look at the biblical account of the kingdom of Solomon, he is an international figure. The material culture and archaeology of the early Iron Age does not support this cosmopolitan international picture. If you look at Solomon through the lens of the Late Bronze Age and look at the archaeology from there, you see an Israel that is really cosmopolitan, really international, and the story or the history of Solomon as we know it better fits the Late Bronze Age material culture than it does the early Iron Age. And so I think that is one of David's most persuasive arguments.
As we stand here in the gate at Megiddo,
the magic of Solomon's name still draws tourists and pilgrims to sites like this. But the Israel of the Iron Age does not reflect the glories of Solomon's reign.
We're standing here on the level of Megiddo that corresponds to about the 10th century, the period when Solomon rebuilt the city. Now, one of the things that the Bible says in 1 Kings 9:15 is that during Solomon's reign, he built the cities of Megiddo, Hazor, and Gezer.
Guides bring tours here to this city gate, which historians say belongs to the time of Solomon.
Now, one of the things the archaeologists discovered here on this Solomonic level is a three-chambered gate, as it's called a triple gate.
But this is an Iron Age gate, and in the new chronology, it cannot be Solomonic. I've asked John Woodhead of the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem to talk about the problems of biblical archaeology.
So, this is called Solomonic.
Yes.
Why is it called Solomonic?
Because people have taken the biblical text, and according to it, Solomon is supposed to have had a city here. And as there is a verse there in the Bible that describes Solomon's activities, naming Megiddo as well, this is taken, and the two things are linked together.
But then we've come to actually saying that the Bible is the source for dating this material.
Yes.
Do you actually accept that?
Well, there are different views on approach to the Bible. There are those who take the Bible totally literally and believe that it can be used as it is. There is another group of people who say you can't use the Bible at all, it is totally unreliable, and therefore you must completely disassociate yourself. There are others who say you have to pick and choose. There are things that are true in the middle, and you have to find out what is true and link them up together. Because so many mistakes have been made in archaeology in the past and linking up to the Bible, as a professional archaeologist, I prefer to start from the point of saying that there is no link. Understanding my archaeology, then work back and see whether there is a link or not.
This here is the gate that everybody says is Solomonic. We've got to go 300 years earlier to find the real Solomonic gate. In the new chronology, it's this one down here. And there's a smashing bit of detail in the Bible which tends to, for me at least, to confirm the idea that this is the Solomonic gate. Listen to this. This is about Solomon's building activity. All these buildings were of special stones cut to measure, trimmed on the inner and outer sides with a saw, from the foundations to the coping. And when he talks specifically about the palaces, he says this: and on the outside, the great court had 3 courses of dressed stone round it and 1 course of cedar beams. Look at this. 1, 2, 3 courses of dressed stones, and then a relief layer here for the cedar beams. This is built to stop the earthquake damage. It's exactly the same as described in the Bible for Solomon.
We have had a problem with relating the Bible to archaeology, and the trend has been to disassociate oneself from the Bible. What this new theory is trying to do is saying, well, we can still retain a lot of what the Bible says and fit it into the archaeology. There are answers to it without holding to necessarily the traditional, conservative, fundamentalist approach to it.
Let me introduce you to what I think was the real world of Solomon. Solomon the Builder King. An amazing gate, beautifully cut stones. And here, a chariot parked for his stretch limo. Now we arrive at the main entrance of the palace with its beautiful basalt staircase. Unfortunately, the palace has been excavated away, but I want to take you down to see what we can find. Looking at this, it's going to require quite a bit of imagination to see what's going on. Try to imagine, however, a palace around the level of my head from the late Bronze Age, King Solomon's palace. Fantastic place. Colonnades leading into courtyards, and these courtyards with a beautiful shell floor. Bedrooms, audience chambers where the king, King Solomon, received his visitors, and above all a treasury with ivory and gold. It's all gone now, but we've got one hope for the future. Over here on this side, you can see the Tell rising up above our heads. And it's in there that we may find the rest of Solomon's palace. Look, there's some stones immediately below the tree, the palm tree there. That's part of the structure. So in the future, the archaeologists may find a way to get inside the Tell and uncover the rest of King Solomon's palace.
The richly carved ivories discovered in this late Bronze Age palace at Megiddo are some of the finest ever found. One in particular stands out. It's a scene of palace life. It's thought to be from a period long before Solomon. But if we apply the new chronology, then this could be a glimpse into the world of Solomon himself. The king arrives in his chariot. Above his head, there's the Egyptian symbol of the winged sun disk. There are several such Egyptian influences in this scene. We see the king sat upon his throne, which is protected by lions, winged sphinxes. His queen offers him a drinking cup and an Egyptian lotus flower. But there's also a biblical connection. Behind the queen, a singer of psalms plays his lyre. Solomon married an Egyptian princess. He had a throne of ivory protected by lions, and all at the time when the psalms were composed. Could this be a representation of King Solomon and his Egyptian queen? To find out more about Solomon's marriage to an Egyptian princess, we must return to Jerusalem, to the Bronze Age city of the Israelite kings.
What we have to do now is to imagine that we're in the time of King Solomon. And of course, Solomon married Pharaoh's daughter. And we have a passage in 2 Chronicles which tells us where Pharaoh's daughter actually lived in Jerusalem. And this is actually what the Bible tells us. Solomon moved Pharaoh's daughter up from the city of David to the palace which he had built for her, up from. I must not be responsible, he said, for a woman living in the palace of David, king of Israel, for these buildings to which the ark of Yahweh have come are sacred.
The Dominican Friary of Saint Etienne is up from or above the city of David. Several small but important discoveries were made here in the last century, but nobody realized their significance until Israeli archaeologist Professor Gabriel Barkai recently stumbled across them.
Perhaps we could have a look at the stela first, is that okay? Gabby, you take it.
This inscription in Egyptian hieroglyphic is the only one ever found in Jerusalem. This is one of the foremost and most important discoveries of Bronze Age Jerusalem. Doesn't matter whether it was found in situ, doesn't matter how we interpret it. This is the only Egyptian inscription which we have from Jerusalem.
There was more than just an inscription. There were fine alabaster vases from Egypt and a beautifully carved statuette of a high-ranking Egyptian lady. All these from the very period in Egyptian history when I believe Solomon reigned in Israel. What the professor had found here pointed to the existence of an Egyptian building or compound looking down on Jerusalem.
This is your little cubbyhole, I believe. Is
Yes.
that right?
My kingdom.
Your kingdom, my goodness.
His curiosity aroused, Professor Barkai searched for other Egyptian objects which might be nearby.
Every time we want to look for something interesting, it's dark.
This is a large quarry, stone quarry, where from we have some iron.
He found one lying abandoned in a forgotten corner of the friary.
Excavated it. This is it.
Where?
Yes,
This is it.
throw some light on the subject.
We've got the sockets here for the fittings of something like that. What is it? Loaves of bread or something like that?
This is first of all, it is a large slab of stone, heavy, made of marblish white stone, which is for sure not local, not Palestinian. Whether it is Egyptian or not, I don't know. And it has some resemblance to the chetep type of Egyptian libation altars or libation tables. It has a series of channels which unite all of them into one spout.
This altar for ritual offerings seemed to suggest that there was also an Egyptian tomb nearby.
This is not an area in which one would anticipate such objects. And the objects themselves, they are of a superb kind. They are not just regular objects that you can dismiss. These are objects of some important tomb or an important temple or something of significance.
And the only Egyptian text that we have in Jerusalem that's ever been found.
The only one, yes. It comes from here.
Professor Barkai believes these objects were part of an Egyptian building, which once stood above the city during the time when I reckon Pharaoh's daughter, Solomon's wife, lived in Jerusalem. Next door to the friary is a place of pilgrimage, an ancient rock tomb thought by some to be the tomb of Jesus. In the grounds of the garden tomb, Professor Barkai discovered a large column capital, the decorated top of a pillar, reused in a stone wall, but clearly Egyptian.
So this is the capital which was found here, built into a fence of the garden tomb premises. The capital has a flat bottom, the diameter of which is 52.5 centimeters, which is exactly one Egyptian cubit.
Right.
It has wide leaves, which are smooth, but a kind of an almond-shaped projection on each of them,
right.
And it has a faceted top part.
And this width here looks to be about half a cubit as well.
The width of each of the leaves is exactly half a cubit. Both the shape, the workmanship, the typology, everything shows it has to be Egyptian. And passing here, I just observed this capital standing here, built into the fence, upside down. And I went further into the material and found out that it has something to do with the very early periods of this vicinity. Actually, the earliest remnants found in this area north of Damascus Gate.
I don't really know if I should be saying this. This is sheer fantasy. Some people might say that everything I've said so far is sheer fantasy. Who knows? But right underneath this floor here is the entrance to a tomb, and it's cut into the cliff face, which is against the side of where this wall is. Now, this tomb that's underneath there is built on the roll cubit, the Egyptian roll cubit. Now, is it remotely possible that we have the finds from the original Egyptian residence over there, underneath the basilica? Beneath my feet we have this tomb, and over the other side of the wall we've got the garden tomb and the Egyptian column capital. You put all those elements together, and we may just have the tomb of Pharaoh's daughter here. All the Egyptian objects found in and around the friary seem to be related to a tomb. Stone pillars may once have supported an entrance. The offering table could have once stood in a chapel. Now, all the measurements in here are of the Egyptian roll cubit, which is a striking feature of this particular tomb. We don't see it anywhere else in Jerusalem. And actually, inside the burial chambers, we have a sort of headrest for the bodies. And this is called the Hathor headrest. It looks like the wig or the hairpiece from her head. So maybe this is also an Egyptian influence. Putting all this together, it seems as if we have a tomb here which was built by Egyptians for Egyptians. I believe it may have belonged to the descendants of the courtiers who attended Pharaoh's daughter. Indeed, could the first occupant of this tomb have been none other than Solomon's Egyptian queen? I hope I've been able to persuade you that the true historical setting for Solomon, a king of extraordinary wealth and power, lies in the prosperous times of the late Bronze Age. An exhibition comes to an end in Vienna. The priceless artifacts are being crated up for their journey home. Of all the exhibits, one is of particular significance to me. It's the head of a colossal statue, which once stood before an Egyptian tomb. But the man of high rank whose image this represents was not Egyptian. Somebody has gone to great lengths to hide his identity. Its face has been savagely attacked, the eyes gouged out. But they left an important clue. Faded bands of blue and red suggest he wore a coat of many colors. Could this be a statue of the biblical patriarch Joseph, the man who brought the children of Israel into the land of the Pharaohs? Our journey starts and ends here at Tel Adaba in Egypt's fertile Nile Delta, where Austrian archaeologists have been digging for 25 years. This is where they found the statue, and where they've unearthed evidence of a city inhabited in ancient times by foreigners.
Manfred. Hi, how are you? Good to see you.
The leader of the excavation is Professor Manfred Bitak.
This is Professor Bob Bianchi. You
How
go.
you doing, Manfred? Good to see you again.
Archaeologists believe that the remains here are much too early to be linked with the Bible stories of the Israelites in Egypt.
How's it going?
I'm fine, thank you.
Oh, good, look at the water level coming up here.
But I've concluded that the chronology established for the ancient world is wrong. With the new chronology I'm proposing, the Bible and archaeology come together to reveal the real world of the Old Testament. Professor Bob Bianchi is here to help me explore the consequences of that shift in time.
If we could demonstrate that we can have evidence of the patriarchs here in Egypt, that would be a truly momentous and extraordinary event. Because after all, and quite frankly, Egyptology developed primarily in the 19th century as a window onto the world of the Bible. And from the beginning of time in Egyptology in the 19th century, Champollion made some kind of linkages between the Old Testament and Egypt, and people have been doing that over and over again, and we've not been able to come up with anything really concrete or tangible. And if we can now come up with a link that, yes, we have evidence of the patriarchs here in Egypt at Tel El-Daba, we will actually have a dream come true, because this is what one aspect of Egyptology has been striving to find for over 150 years, and that would be truly extraordinary.
I've tried to show that several centuries need to be taken out of the chronology for ancient Egypt. The dates for the pharaohs change. Ramesses II moves down from the 13th century BC to 925 BC, the date the Bible gives for when Jerusalem was plundered. Now, dramatic new links can be forged between the history of Egypt and the Bible stories. I'm going to show you new evidence that Saul and David weren't mythical kings of Israel, but real people living in a real world. Then, working backwards in time, we'll find Joshua, who conquered the Promised Land, Moses, who led the Israelites out of Egypt, and lastly, Joseph, who rose to prominence in Pharaoh's court. Akhenaten was the predecessor of Tutankhamun. In the new chronology, Akhenaten drops down over 300 years to the end of the 11th century, and we now find him ruling in Egypt at the same time as the rise to power of the first kings of Israel. Akhenaten was a dreamer, and because of his neglect, Egypt lost control of a great northern empire, including the Holy Land. He abandoned Egypt's old state gods and worshipped the one god, Ra, in the form of the Artan sun disk. In the 1890s, an extraordinary discovery was made on the site of Akhenaten's capital, at Amarna. A peasant woman found a buried hoard of clay tablets, covered in ancient writing. They turned out to be diplomatic letters sent to Pharaoh.
How much is that? There's a fiver.
These tablets are now dispersed throughout the great museums of the world. The British Museum in London holds many of the most important Amarna letters, especially those which deal with the revolt in the hill country of Palestine. They contain invaluable details about Egypt and its neighbouring states. As you can see, they're small tablets. The writing is absolutely minuscule. You can hardly read it without the aid of a magnifying glass. They're letters from the city-state rulers of Palestine to Egypt, to Pharaoh in Egypt. And they contain a wealth of political information of the time. Now this is a crucial test for the new chronology, because this is the time of the new chronology of Saul and David. So now we have an opportunity to compare an ancient document like these with the Old Testament narratives. In the standard chronology, these letters were written hundreds of years before the time when Saul and David ruled in the hill country of Palestine. But in my chronology, 3.5 centuries have disappeared, and now the Amarna letters and the stories in the book of Samuel are set in the same era. These tablets should provide eyewitness accounts of the rise of Israel, of Saul and David, and the successful Hebrew revolt against the Philistines. One of the most interesting things we find in the Amarna letters concerns a group of people called the Habiru. Now these Habiru seem to be stateless people. They live in the hill country, but they sell their services as mercenaries, fighting men, in the forces of the various city-state rulers down in the coastal plain. Now that's a very similar sort of situation to what we find in the book of Samuel, where we find David outlawed from the court of King Saul, fleeing out into hill country, and gathering around him lots of disparate folk. And these disparate folk form into an army, a veritable band of soldiers, 600 men in fact. These Hebrews also hire themselves out as mercenaries to the Philistine kings down in the lowlands. So the interesting question we have here is, are the Habiru of the Amarna letters one and the same as the Hebrews in the book of Samuel? The problem is, there's about 300 years difference between the Habiru of the Amarna letters and the Hebrews of David's time. But in the new chronology, of course, that 300 years disappears. If the Habiru are the Hebrews, they should also be linked to King Saul. In the Amarna letters, the Habiru chieftain is called Labayu. Now this Labayu is the ruler of the hill country where we are now. Now that's exactly the same area which King Saul rules over. So is it possible that Labayu and Saul are the same person? There's an Amarna letter in the British Museum in which Labayu complains to Pharaoh that he's being maligned by his enemies, when all he's done is to recapture his hometown from those unnamed enemies. Labayu justifies his action like this.
The city, along with my God, was seized. I am slandered before the king, my lord. Moreover, when an ant is struck, does it not fight back and bite the hand of the man that struck it?
This sounds almost like a biblical proverb, and what's more, the account of Labayu retaking his hometown is very similar to a story we find in the Bible. King Saul recovers his hometown from the Philistines, and that place is here. Whilst we've been filming here at Jebba, something has just dawned on me. I almost stumbled across it. In the Bible stories, we hear that Saul's hometown, Gibeah or Jebba, there was a high place, and this high place was a sacred area. And in the high place, the Philistines erected a standing stone, what they call a netziv. And I think we've got it here. There seems to be a socket down here, which, well, I don't know, it looks to be about the same size as we'd expect for a net sieve, about 25 centimetres. Nicely cut recesses. More sockets up here for standing stones as well, another one over there. This could be Saul's high place. Seems to be some more features here. This is obviously clearly man-made. This is not natural wearing. Where's a tomb? So we've got tombs, standing stones, what appear to be rock-cut altars all around the place. Some more cuttings here. And this looks like the base of the enclosure wall down here as well. So the whole thing's on the side of the hill. It seems to be facing, what, due east, I think. Let's just check. There's our north. So the whole of this sort of area is facing east towards the rising sun. I think this is Saul's high place. You're probably asking yourself, hang on a minute, what's this guy actually saying here? He's saying that King Lebayu of the Amarna letters is the same as King Saul in the book of Samuel. But the two names are completely different. How can that be? Well, what you have to understand is this. The name Saul, Hebrew Shaul, means asked for. The people came to the prophet Samuel and said, we want a king like every other nation. So he was asked for by the people to be their first king. So it's a traditional name. It's not actually the name he was born with or the name he was anointed as king of Israel. It's the name that's given to him by some later redactor or editor of the Bible. So he must have had another name in his real life. And I think that name was Lebayu, the lion. If Lebayu really is Saul, can the Amarna letters shed light on the most dramatic event of Saul's reign, the final bloody battle on Mount Gilboa in which he perished? In one Amarna letter, we learn that Lebayu also died in battle, and in the vicinity of Mount Gilboa. The Battle of Gilboa was a complete disaster for the Israelites. King Saul himself was killed. The army was decimated by the Philistine forces. I've always wondered why that actually happened, given Saul's superb position. Here he is on top of the mountain with his forces. The Philistines are down in the valley. They had to come up and meet the Israelites. And yet they won and the Israelites lost. Combining the information from the Amarna letters about the fate of Lebayu and the Bible account of King Saul's death, I think I can piece together what really happened here. It's just one short line in a letter sent to Akhenaten that makes all the difference. This is the clue which tells us what happened to Saul and his army. It mentions the citizens of a place called Gina. Now, Gina is the ancient name of modern Jenin, and Jenin is down in the valley there on the southern slopes of Gilboa. And it says that these citizens betrayed Lebayu, King Saul. And I think these people actually collude with the Philistines and allow the Philistine archers to come up to the rear of the Israelite army to attack and kill King Saul. In David's famous lament over the death of King Saul, he curses the battlefield where the first Israelite king met his end. He calls the place treacherous fields, Hebrew, Sede Tamit. Why treacherous? The Amarna letters give us the answer. Saul died on Mount Gilboa because he was betrayed by his own people. After Saul's death, David becomes king of the Israelites and lays siege to the city of Jerusalem. In the Amarna letters, Abdi-Heber, king of Jerusalem, writes to Pharaoh in a state of panic. The Habiru are at the gates of the city. The king of Jerusalem pleads with Akhenaten to send troops to rescue him from his enemies. Now that's the last we hear of Abdi-Heber. The Bible gives us the final piece of information. In a single sentence, it tells us that King David and his Habiru army, his Hebrews, capture the city of Jerusalem, which becomes the political and religious capital of the Kingdom of Israel. It's extraordinary to think that here in the British Museum, and in the Berlin Museum, and the Louvre, and the Cairo Museum, we have letters from the time of King Saul and King David. It's now contemporary with the Alamana period, and we actually have here, in this tray, a letter from King Saul, a letter from his son Ishmael containing the name of King David. What an amazing discovery. Professor Kenneth Kitchen teaches here at Liverpool University. He's a firm defender of the current chronology. One of his main objections to the new chronology is that he thinks it fails to take account of the changing political pattern in the ancient Near East.
Here are 3 maps for, I hope, different periods in the period we're dealing with.
Yeah.
Now, it's wonderful to have new chronologies, but there are problems if you look at the geography and politics. In the 13th century, Ramesses' empire came from the south, Hittites came in from the north, and you have that sort of picture. Then, if we drop a couple of hundred years, we come to an entirely different world. Ramesses is gone, the Hittites are gone, and the so-called Empire of Israel.
Right,
David
this
and
is
Solomon,
David and Solomon, yes, right.
And the names are beginning to change. Move on 50, 60 years after Solomon's gone, an entirely different world again, not only from this, but above all from this.
Yep.
On this map, there are no empires of anybody. And the important thing is that between those 200 or 300 years, the names are completely different states.
That's interesting, you see, because in my model, of course, these are the wrong way around. I mean, we'd have to have them in that order, which then emphasises this point you're making, that in fact the similarities are in fact between that one and that one,
yes,
which are now separated
you
by this
nasty anomaly in the middle.
Yes.
Now, it's all very well, of course, to try and change the order of politics, but you get an anomaly. I think really what happens if you have one set of states like Aram, Hamath, and so on, disappearing with a completely different set of states, and then suddenly reappearing. It doesn't quite work like that.
Which political view are we looking at? From which country do these maps come from?
These are international maps, because from the Egyptian documents we know about Canaan, from the Amarna documents in Egypt, but also from here, and of course from Mitanni, the odd letter which reached Egypt shows their perspective. So it's an international map. Well, I can understand the attractions of a novel chronology, but I think when you get history running forwards, backwards, and forwards, I have to say goodbye, that it won't work.
That's interesting, you see, because I think the geography issue raised by Professor Kitchen is a bit of a red herring. Drawing maps for this period can be misleading. It's a simple fact that people give different names to the same places. For instance, at the start of this century, St. Petersburg was the capital of Russia. Then the same city became part of the Soviet Union, renamed Leningrad. Now it's St. Petersburg in Russia again. Do we deny the reality of history because it appears to be running forwards, then backwards, then forwards again? A good example of what the new chronology can do for history comes when we journey further back in time, to the period when the Israelites entered the Promised Land. The first city taken by them under Joshua's leadership was Jericho, the Jericho whose walls came a-tumbling down.
And the Lord said unto Joshua, See, I have given into thine hand Jericho and the king thereof. And it came to pass, when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted with a great shout, that the wall fell down flat.
When John Garstang dug here in the 1930s, he thought he'd discovered the collapsed walls of Joshua's Jericho. But 20 years later, another British archaeologist, Dame Kathleen Kenyon, overturned his findings. She worked out that at the time when the Israelites were supposed to have entered the Promised Land, Jericho was virtually an abandoned ruin. This was tantamount to saying that the story of the Israelite conquest was nothing more than a myth.
This amazing hole is one of Kathleen Kenyon's excavation trenches, which she cut deep into the mound of Jericho. As I go deeper into it, we're actually going back in time, right down to about 10,000 years ago. The bottom of the ladder, in fact, is in the Stone Age. And as I climb up, ascending the face of the wall here in front of me, we're actually travelling forward in time through the early Bronze Age to the Middle Bronze Age, and then up into the Late Bronze Age and Iron Age and towards modern times. Sort of try and imagine this thing to be a sort of layer cake of time. The bottom layers are the earliest, As we go higher, we get later and later through time.
In the conventional chronology, the Israelite conquest of the Promised Land falls at the end of the archaeological period known as the Late Bronze Age. But in the new chronology, the archaeological ages shift downwards, and we must now look for evidence of the conquest in an earlier period, known as the Middle Bronze Age. I've come to the site of ancient Jericho with Peter Parr, who worked here with Kathleen Kenyon, and Dr. John Bimson, a biblical historian specialising in the conquest. First, we went to see the walls that Garstang mistakenly thought had collapsed during Joshua's attack.
You can understand in a way why Garstang made that mistake and associated it with the collapse of Jericho in Joshua's day,
indeed.
because you can see the bricks falling down the slope there.
Very pronounced, aren't they?
Indeed, you can, yes.
In the traditional chronology, the traditional date for the conquest of the Promised Land, this tell was actually an abandoned ruin. There was no major city here with fortification walls?
There is no evidence of fortification walls implying any sort of major settlement in the Late Bronze Age.
But Kenyon did find evidence of a city here in the Middle Bronze Age, which is where John Bimson and I think we should look for the conquest.
If we walk further down the slope here, we can see the fortifications of the Middle Bronze Age city. And that consisted of slopes, artificial slopes, plastered with a hard white plaster to make them more consolidated and difficult to climb.
What happens to that city?
Well, that city was destroyed at the end of the Middle Bronze Age, which most scholars would consider too early for Joshua's attack on Jericho.
Now, I would say that we actually need to look again at that date, because the evidence for this being the city that Joshua attacked and destroyed is actually very strong. First of all, if you think about the nature of the city itself, it's clear from the Bible that Jericho was a strong, fortified city, which is what you've got here. So it's a really impressive fortification system. In the Bible, the city is destroyed by fire. Over on the eastern side of the slope, Kenyon excavated a residential area, lots of little houses and narrow streets. And that area is overlaid by a thick layer of destruction debris, which she said was clear evidence of burning. And just before the burning took place, she said the walls of those houses had collapsed. Now that could be evidence for an earthquake just before the fire, which is what you have in Joshua 6, where the walls of the city collapse, apparently as a consequence of an earthquake, something very sudden and unexpected, and then once the Israelites have captured it, they deliberately set it on fire.
I'm with you on this altogether, because as far as I'm concerned, the new chronology has brought me to the same point. I'm actually also arguing this Middle Bronze Age fortification here is the one with the walls that fell down. The difference is that I've come about it from the Egyptian evidence, and I actually get the same date of 1400 BC for the MB walls.
Time then to take a closer look at what's left of the Middle Bronze Age walls which Kathleen Kenyon discovered.
And presumably this is a bit of it, is it?
Those look like the foundations that Kenyon reported as being the foundations of the wall on top of the rampart.
I know it really sounds corny, but actually what we've got here is a set of walls that actually went tumbling down the hill.
That's exactly it, yes.
Another site where archaeologists look for evidence of the conquest is in northern Israel, the city of Hatzor.
And Joshua at that time turned back and took Hatzor and smote the king thereof with the sword. For Hatzor before time was the head of all those kingdoms. And he burned Hatzor with fire.
If Jericho disappointed archaeologists looking for the conquest, then Hatzor fulfilled their expectations. The large late Bronze Age palace discovered here was clearly destroyed by fire. To some, the link was obvious. In charge of the excavations here is Professor Amnon Ben-Tor of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem.
What we have here is only the Bible.
Yes.
To talk for us, to make these stones speak.
Yeah.
We only have the Bible. because there are no contemporary records of the people of the time. But what I can tell you for sure is that Greater Chatzor, okay, 10 times the size of Jerusalem, if you wish, Canaanite Chatzor was destroyed by a huge fire.
Hatzor would have been a key target for Joshua and the Israelite army.
Okay, this is the one.
Archaeologists found two palaces here, one from the Middle Bronze Age, the new chronology candidate,
So you come in between,
and one from the Late Bronze Age, the conventional candidate for the conquest.
okay, so this is the forecourt and two stairs. Each one is made up of two enormous slabs. They have cracked like everything else because of the intense fire here. And all these bricks, the red that you can see just ahead of you, these are markings of the fire that brought an end to Canaanite Chatzor. If we want to talk about the fire or the destruction, maybe we should go
You've got
inside.
a detail somewhere?
Yeah, it's an enormous detail.
Is it?
Yeah.
Whereabouts? Down here?
Yeah, if you go all the way down,
Right.
go, please, go on.
Okay.
All the way, yeah. And that's it. Now look. Now, if you move a little bit back, that's it. You see
Down
this
here?
black, it's a layer of a terrible destruction. All the other cities, the kings were just killed. Chatzor, everybody was killed, and the city was put to the fire because it was formerly the head of all those kingdoms. Here is the final fire, or the end of Canaanite Chatzor.
So what we have here is, potentially at least, a late Bronze Age destruction by fire, and the story in the Old Testament of Joshua and the conquest of the Israelites of the Promised Land. The big question is, can you put those two things together?
If the Egyptian king Thutmose III would have said, I conquered Chatzor, and you'd say, well, here, this is Thutmose III. But if it says so in the Bible, then it's suspicious. Then it's a question.
Yeah.
Why? What's the difference?
Right.
If Thutmose III said it, it could have happened, he could have just boasted.
Yeah.
In the Bible, it could have happened, they could have just boasted. I think it should be, even though one is engraved in stone and the other one is in paper, but still these are documents, it should be at least given the same chance.
Yeah, I agree.
The biblical record. So it is very, very possible that the biblical story or the narrative of Joshua has some historical truth to it.
So both Amnon Ben-Tor and I agree that Hatzor could have been destroyed by Joshua. But I think it happened in a different period, in the time of the Middle Bronze Age.
Now, my candidate, the new chronology candidate, is represented by these huge basalt bases here for pillars, which once stood in front of a very large building over here. Now, this is the Middle Bronze Age palace. It's constructed of huge boulders, very, very wide walls. This just represents one corner of it.
It looks as if an archive, a collection of letters, may well be recovered from this Middle Bronze Age palace. 3 letters have already been discovered, and one of them seems to mention the name Jabin, the name of the king of Hatzor killed by Joshua when the Israelites destroyed the city.
We have a document which mentions Ibni, the name of the king of Hatzor, who is mentioned in the contemporary archive, all contemporary with this palace.
Now, this name Ibni, come on, I need to know what this biblical equivalent of that is.
Perhaps Jabin or Yabin. We know from the book of Judges, we know the name of the king of Hatzor was Yavin, king of Canaan, okay?
Right,
Not
yeah.
only of Hatzor,
Yeah.
of Canaan, to show you the importance of the city of Hatzor. All these date to the period of this palace.
Right.
However, we also have in Egypt, as you know very well, the Amarna archive, 3 letters sent by the king of Hatzor, which should be the man of this one here. In the best of all worlds, we shall have one here and one there.
You promised me to send me a telegram when you find it.
I'll send you a ticket.
A ticket to come and look. Sure. That's what I need.
Okay.
Come on! A colleague from the United States has been working on some astronomical data for me. I've come to the Internet Cafe in London to collect the results. From an ancient Jewish source, we learned that the pharaoh who raised Moses as a prince of Egypt was called Kar-Neferre, and Kar-Neferre was a pharaoh of the 13th dynasty. There's a neat way to pinpoint his place in time. It all depends on the coronation date for a king of ancient Babylon, King Amizaduga. In his reign, the priests kept records of the rising and setting of the planet Venus. Today's computers can work out precisely when these occurred. My friend and colleague Wayne Mitchell in California is doing the number crunching for me. Basing their calculations on the conventional chronology, scholars have suggested 2 possible dates for Amizaduga's coronation. 1702 BC and 1582 BC. But neither of them score highly when checked against the Babylonian records. But I now have a third date, 1419 BC, a date which has never been tried before.
Wayne really has come up with the goods this time. He's compared 31 eclipses from the ancient world. The Venus solution 1702, 1582 and 1419 BC, the new chronology date. If we look at the data, 1702, lots of no's, lots of mismatches. 1582, just as many. But when we get to 1419 BC, it's yes, 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 yes. There's one no out of 31. That's 30 out of 31. That's 97% accurate. I'm convinced now that has to be the right date, 1419 BC.
Working back just over a century from this date of 1419 BC, we come to the Babylonian king Hammurabi. Other ancient documents show that he was a contemporary of the pharaoh Neferhotep in Egypt. And Neferhotep was the immediate predecessor of Moses' stepfather, King Karneferet. That gives us a date for the birth of Moses of around 1535 BC. According to the new chronology, the 13th dynasty pharaohs are now the masters of the Israelite slaves in Egypt. Moses, who led the children of Israel to freedom, has a new place in history. But the story of the Israelites in Egypt begins with Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his jealous brothers. Eventually, he found favor with Pharaoh by interpreting his dreams. From the Bible, we can work out that Joseph arrived in Egypt about 130 years before the birth of Moses. In the new chronology, that would mean Joseph the Vizier served a pharaoh of the 12th dynasty, Amenemhat III. It's interesting to find that in this very period, the Egyptians were making wall paintings of foreigners from Canaan, coming into Egypt wearing multicolored coats.
One of the most colorful stories in the Bible is that of Joseph and the Egyptian famine. Joseph predicts from Pharaoh's dream that will be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. Now, is there any evidence in the reign of Amenemhat III of famine?
Until recently, agriculture in Egypt was dependent on the annual flooding of the Nile Valley, when the river broke its banks and flowed into the fields. Famine conjures up the idea of drought, but too much water can also be damaging. If the Nile inundation was too severe, the fields would still be waterlogged when it came to the time for planting. If this happened for several years in a row, then a famine like the one described in the Bible could result. There is evidence that the Nile levels during the reign of Joseph's pharaoh, Amenemhat III, were excessively high. Dr. Barbara Bell of Harvard University has made a study of these high Niles.
We have an increase of 3 to 4 times the amount of water entering the Nile Valley in the late Middle Kingdom.
Yes.
Compared to a modern flood level?
And that seems to be a huge, significant difference.
Yes, quite a huge difference. And I suppose the significance is how long the water stays on the fields. If they lasted a month, that could be very bad indeed, because the fields would stay flooded long beyond the proper time for planting.
Right, and then therefore no harvest.
No harvest and famine.
Famine's a big word.
Yes. For a long time, people were not inclined to accept it, and they thought it was a question of the riverbed eroding, but recent geological studies have shown that the riverbed is very hard there and would not have eroded significantly in the time, so it has to be water, excess water.
So the result of it would be absolutely catastrophic in terms of what was going on in the Nile Valley.
Yes, especially considering the philosophy of the Egyptians that the king was responsible for the good order of nature. Well, the pharaohs of this period had uniquely glum and realistic expressions, sort of oppressed by the burdens of the world or the burdens of their job, which is very untypical of Egyptian art.
I can't think of any from earlier or later than this period.
No, I can't either.
So it seems that there may have been a famine, and at the very time when we place Joseph as vizier of Egypt. The Bible also says that Joseph was told in a dream to prepare for the years of want. There is every sign of such preparations in the reign of Amenemhat III. In Middle Egypt, he built a canal from the Nile, which emptied the excess floodwater into a great lake. Today, that canal is still called the Bach Yosef, the waterway of Joseph. At the outflow of the canal, Amenemhat built two colossal statues. When the ancient Greek historian Herodotus came here, he was overawed. He knew the builder of the giant statues as King Meroes, the legendary name of Pharaoh Amenemhat. There is other evidence of Joseph's work nearby. The Bible tells us that Joseph reorganized the Egyptian state, bringing grain supplies under the direct control of Pharaoh's officials. The evidence from Amenemhat's reign suggests that just such a reorganization took place. One of its centers was here, at Hawara, where archaeologists found the remains of the legendary Egyptian labyrinth of King Meroes.
Here we are with our first view of the labyrinth in modern times. As you can see, it's a bit of a wreck. It's not exactly impressive. However, in the time of Herodotus in the 5th century BC, this was the greatest achievement that mankind had ever constructed. It was a series of courts, 12 courts in all, surrounded by separate chambers in a labyrinthine pattern. It was so complex that nobody could find their way out of it once they'd entered it. So the legend went.
Amenemhat was so pleased with Joseph's new administrative center that he decided to build his pyramid next to it, so that he could remain for eternity close to the greatest achievement of his reign. Floods and famine, the reorganization of the state, the historical and archaeological evidence for the reign of Pharaoh Amenemhat seems to fit the picture of Joseph the vizier which emerges from the Bible pretty well. The vizier's reward for saving Egypt was permission from Pharaoh for Joseph's brethren to settle in the fertile Egyptian Nile Delta. Though the Bible implies that Joseph's people spent over 2 centuries here in the land of Goshen, no archaeological evidence has ever been found for them. So the Israelites' sojourn in the land of the Pharaohs has been written off as myth. But if the new chronology is right, archaeologists may have been looking for them in the right place, but in the wrong time. It's here that the Austrian archaeological team has been making some amazing discoveries.
They can't go down more than a few feet before they hit the sort of...
What they've uncovered is a city, the ancient lost city of Avaris. Amazingly, its population was of Semitic origin, people from Palestine. Could these people be the Israelites? If so, then these precious objects recovered from the graves may once have belonged to Israelite chieftains. Towards the end of the 13th dynasty, tragedy struck this city. All over the site, the Austrians have uncovered mass burials in shallow pits. The bodies were thrown in, one on top of the other. Avaris was struck by a deadly plague. Immediately afterwards, most of the population simply gathered up their possessions and left. The city was abandoned. It sounds remarkably like the story of the Exodus.
If you take the archaeological evidence from Avaris and compare it to the Bible's account of the Israelites in Egypt, it all seems to fit rather well. First we have a foreign population entering the eastern delta and settling down here. Then there's a terrible plague and they seem to abandon the city. Now, this all could be coincidence, but I don't think so.
In front of us is a new...
Professor Manfred Bieter is the director of the dig.
But what you see here now, it's a very controversial theory, a radical theory. However, controversial theories have the benefit that they would stimulate reviews of accepted historical views. This is a benefit. For my understanding, the time gap of 3 centuries is a very big one, and I see several problems arising. However, this theory will stimulate discussion and surely perhaps even bring about some kind of cuts in the chronology.
Professor Bitak believes that these foreigners from Canaan are much too early, archaeologically speaking, to be identified with the Israelites. But of course, he's working within the conventional chronology.
At the end of the 12th dynasty, Canaanites, people from Canaan, were settled here, surely with the blessing of the Egyptian pharaohs, with full intention of establishing here something like a trading center and also a military center. Well, the first Egyptian residence was probably belonging to the mayor of this settlement, and according to seals found within a cemetery attached to this palace, that the inhabitants of the palace, or the residents of the palace, were Egyptian officials, however of Asiatic origin.
So, right. So foreigners working for the pharaoh here in the Eastern Delta.
That's right.
That's extremely interesting. What are your opinions of this idea that these people that we've been talking about are actually the sort of proto-Israelites, the origins of the stories of Joseph and the sojourn in Egypt?
I would prefer to speak of Israelites only much later, as biblical texts were not written before perhaps the 8th century BC, and biblical traditions should not be focused backwards too much in time.
Time and again one says, sorry, this, and this don't add up. It doesn't seem to be possible. With the best will in the world, all of us want to try and do better if we can, but novelty is never the judge of truth.
He's prepared to be wrong. He wants people to come along and think about what he's been saying and either accept it if they're convinced or try and prove him wrong. And I think that is the way scholarship works. That is a good academic methodology.
One particular discovery made by the Austrian excavators could be the most amazing find of all. They came across the remains of a palace and a tomb, both built in the Egyptian style, but not for an Egyptian. The occupant, the founder of the city, seems to have been a foreigner who rose to high rank during the reign of Amenemhat III.
I know it's hard to imagine, but once in this spot here there was a magnificent tomb. It had a very elegant pyramid on top of it, and it stood in the corner of a garden. Now that garden is all around here, and to the north over there was once a magnificent palace to go with that tomb. Now the owner of that palace was probably the person who was buried in this tomb. Beneath the pyramid was a deep burial chamber, and in front of the burial chamber a chapel. Now both the burial chamber and the chapel were completely empty except for the shattered remains of a colossal statue. I think this is the tomb of Joseph, and that Joseph once lived in that palace.
To understand why the tomb was empty, we need to return to the book of Exodus. Generations after Joseph's death, the Israelite slaves were finally freed from bondage. Moses and the children of Israel departed from Egypt, taking with them the body of Joseph in his Egyptian coffin. With Moses gone, all the Egyptians had left on which to exact their revenge was the cult statue of the Israelite vizier, still standing in the chapel of his now empty tomb.
The cult statue was savagely attacked. Somebody has tried to smash the skull in two, cleave it in half. This fails, so then they attack the face. They smash off the nose, the mouth and the chin. All that's left are the sockets of the eyes. The inlaid eyes have been thrown away. But we can still see fragments of the original likeness. A yellow skin, denoting a foreigner, not an Egyptian. Flame red hair.
We can see on the shoulder the throw stick, the insignia of office of this man, and then a multicoloured coat around his shoulders and down his back. Is this Joseph? And so our journey back through time comes to an end with the story of Joseph. I didn't set out to prove the Bible. My challenge was to construct a new chronology for Egypt. But that chronology has taken me into the world of biblical history and archaeology. There, I've been able to show you the wealth and high culture of Israel's first kings. Letters from King Saul lying unrecognized in the British Museum. Together we've visited Joshua's Jericho with its tumbled walls, and the city of the Israelite sojourn in Egypt. And finally, the tomb of the vizier Joseph with its mutilated cult statue. Now, as we approach the beginning of a new millennium, the hidden world of the Old Testament is finally coming to light.